All right, so the delegates to the second, well, it was written over there, the Second Continental Congress, they knew that they did not want a strong central government. They were worried about too much power being concentrated in a small number of hands, or just one hand in the case of the king. They were worried about that. And most people in the U.S., of course, in 1777, 1781, when this thing was written and ratified by the colonies at the time, later states, most of the people in those colonies did not identify as Americans. They didn't identify, of course, there was no actual America in 1781. It was still this idea of America, but it wasn't an actual thing. It wasn't an actual country until 1783. So really, there was no thing to latch on to. Right? They were all the colonists. They were Pennsylvanians, or South Carolinians, or New Yorkers, or Virginians. Their loyalty was to their state. It wasn't to the country. So we have to keep those two things in mind. That they were worried about too much power being centralized, and they didn't have loyalty to, not to the same degree that they did to their state. They didn't say, I'm an American. They said, I'm Virginian. Right? So we got to keep those two things in mind as we look at how the government was organized under the AOC, the Articles of Confederation. Right? So first thing we need to know is that there was a very small central government. And there was only one branch. Only one branch. And I'll put it over here. Only one branch of government. That was the legislative branch. There was no executive branch, no judicial branch. So that meant that there was no one to enforce laws, no one to resolve disputes. So the president, the executive, now anyway, part of the job of the president is to enforce laws. The president does that through various agencies enforcing laws. FBI and the FDA, and there's all kinds of agencies, right, that enforce laws. There's no branch that settles disputes between states or among states. That's the Supreme Court in the case of the country right now. But back then, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no Supreme Court. There was no judicial system that could settle disputes between states, or at the time between colonies. In fact, really, it was just a loose confederation of states or colonies. Very loose confederation. It was not anything unified like now. We think it's the United States of America. It's country first before state, in most cases anyway. There's bound to be some folks from Texas who say, I'm a Texan first. That's supposed to be a joke, even though it's true. But really, most people put country first. Back then they put state first or colony first, but before it became a country, before it became the U.S. So, loose confederation of states, only one branch of government, the legislative branch. And so that was Congress. And Congress was weak. A weak Congress. Congress could pass laws, but 9 states, now there were only 13 in the beginning, so 9 of 13 states had to approve those laws for the laws to go into effect. Now think about how that would work. Congress would have to pass a law, would have to handwrite it, multiple copies, send it out to multiple couriers or multiple representatives to ride a wagon or a horse back to their state, which would take a while to get there. If you're in the middle of the country and you had to ride all the way to South Carolina or Georgia or Rhode Island, I mean, it would take a while. You had to go different places. They had to talk about it, vote on it, and then ride back. It's days and days and days, and maybe weeks, maybe months. I mean, it's a long period of time for 9 of 13 states. So if only 8 approved a law, it did not go into effect. So it was a very weak Congress, could not do much. They could not tax. They couldn't tax. The central government of the country at the time, for the first few years, could not raise taxes. It had to ask the states for money. And the states did not have to give Congress any money. So how do you do things? How do you have a postal service? Well, you don't have a postal service. How do you have roads that go from one state to another that are maintained by, like, the highway system that we take for granted? Highway system, what, are you kidding me? Cooperation between states, federal government to oversee all that did not happen back then. Wasn't going to happen. So they couldn't tax, couldn't regulate trade. They couldn't regulate trade between states, and they couldn't regulate trade with in between states and other countries. They couldn't regulate trade between the country and other countries. Now let's think about that. So if you want to buy something, we take it for granted now. If we want to buy something that's made in Oregon, we just go to Amazon or we go to Walmart or we go somewhere and we buy it and it's made in Oregon, it just gets shipped to us. Or it's already in a store. We don't even think about it. It's not a big deal at all. Well, back then, if you lived in Pennsylvania and you wanted to buy something from South Carolina, you couldn't rely on an easy trading system because it didn't exist. Different states had different rules about trade. So trade was actually a thing from one state to another state. Now we just put stuff on a truck and it gets shipped from one state to another. It was not the case back then. Not the case back then. The Congress could not raise or maintain an army. So after the war, the Continental Army was disbanded. And even if they hadn't disbanded them, they couldn't pay them anyway. They didn't have any money to pay them because they couldn't tax. They had asked the states, and the states were going to say no to that. So they disbanded the army, and they couldn't raise another army. So if the country was invaded by another country, they could not be protected. Maybe by state militias, maybe. So they're going to have probably more of a problem than they would have during the colonial period, or the same kind of problem. But that's how, and I'm getting into problems a little bit because they are connected. But how was the government organized? It was a loose confederation. There was only one branch, the legislative branch, no executive, no judicial branch. A weak Congress, it couldn't tax, it couldn't regulate trade between states or between countries, meaning the U.S. and other countries. It couldn't raise or maintain an army. And what we're going to see in just a moment in this next video is that caused a lot of problems. And those problems eventually led to, in 1787, led to the writing of the Constitution to try to remedy those problems. So let's go ahead and go to the next video about the problems caused by the Articles of Confederation.